Meanwhile, news of the first COVID-19 case here was announced by the Prime Minister in Sydney a short time ago after her bilateral meeting with Scott Morrison. During that meeting, she launched a scathing attack on Australia's deportation policy, describing it as corrosive to the Anzac relationship. Our political reporter Jo Moir is travelling with the Prime Minister and she joins us now. Good evening, Jo. Could you just paint us a bit of a picture here? What was the atmosphere like while Jacinda Ardern was delivering this, could we call it a rebuke?
Yeah, definitely, Lisa. It was a phenomenal press conference. It really felt as if sort of all of the tensions and frustrations that Jacinda Ardern's had over this policy just kind of all boiled up really in that press conference. Scott Morrison seemed quite shocked at times by what she was saying. It was interesting. Her overall message, really, the simple request was, send back Kiwis, genuine ones. Do not deport your people and your problems to New Zealand. She gave in a situation where a woman who had moved to Australia when she was 1, had 3 children there, is now in New Zealand in a crisis centre after having nowhere to go. She said, look, I'm not asking you to stop the policy, but amongst those 2,000 people that have been deported back since 2015, she says there are people there that are too young to become criminals and gang members, and that's exactly what's happening when they do return here. So, I mean, it was going into it, we had received a joint press conference statement from the two, and it seemed a lot nicer. And then all of a sudden, Jacinda Ardern just came out with these comments and sort of really bowled Morrison over at times, actually. He then took his turn and he threw it straight back, really. He said the policy's clear. We deport non-citizens who have committed crimes against our community. He said this isn't specific to New Zealand. He said it's across the board, so it's nothing personal in this Trans-Tasman relationship at all. His message was, once you've done your time, we send you home because it's in our national interest. And that's the crunch, really. It's in their national interest. And it works for Scott Morrison, and it works for his country, and so it's just not going to change. Now, one of the reporters there at the press conference put blatantly to Scott Morrison, will you make any changes to this policy? And it was a flat-out no from him. Obviously, Jacinda Ardern, leading up to this, had talked about that relationship being corrosive, but she really upped the ante on that today. But as Scott Morrison said, if you aren't a citizen and you commit a crime, well, you're just not welcome to stay.
Jo, do you think, I know the Prime Minister has used the word gnarly today, so do you think that Scott Morrison realised it was going to get this gnarly? Because he was standing there, picturesque harbour in the background, she's saying these quite harsh words, and he had this fixed grin on his face the whole time. Do you think he expected it to be like it was?
No, because, I mean, he would have been getting told what was coming through the media during the course of the day. And, I mean, gnarly is not as strong as corrosive. I mean, it's a strong word, but, I mean, what she ended up saying in that press conference in his harbour, standing right next to him was quite phenomenal, as I said. And I think, you look at some of the sort of images, the stills of his face when she was saying some of the stuff, he was almost a bit defiant. I mean, shocked at times, but a bit defiant. There's just no room for any movement on this policy at all, and he was holding his ground well and truly. So, I mean, considering, they talk all the time about this relationship and how important it is, they had all of those niceties at sort of the top of the press conference, much more so from Scott Morrison, I must say. Jacinda Ardern kind of launched her attack pretty early on in her piece. But, it's sort of, you felt like Scott Morrison was sort of laying out the fact that they'd had this really lovely chat, and then sort of boom, there was Jacinda Ardern saying, well, actually, you guys are just not being fair, and we're not saying stop your policy, but just play a little bit fair with us.
So what about climate change then? Because, they seem to be on vastly different pages there as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, couldn't be further apart, to be honest. They're sitting there still saying, from their respective countries with their own domestic policies, they'll do what they're going to do. And when they have their conversations, all they're talking about is the impact on the Pacific. Now, Scott Morrison blatantly said, why would they challenge each other over domestic policies when they're both seeking to take action? Now, that was an interesting comment, because you talk to the Australian press, and we've been with them all day today, and they'd say very differently in terms of whether there's been any action. And there was definitely some eyebrows raised by the Australians there watching that press conference in the media when he said that, they were taking action and they were taking it seriously, because I think, it's pretty accepted, and even Jacinda Ardern would accept that, New Zealand is doing a lot more than Australia is, but they're just not going to talk about that.
So given everything that's happened today, the public comments, how would you characterise the relationship with our closest neighbour?
Well, we just had a stand-up with the Prime Minister not long ago, actually, and we asked the question whether it was sort of an awkward conversation between them as they walked back together following that press conference. She said, no, it's not. She said, look, they have this relationship where they are frank with each other and they just say it how it is. So I don't think she necessarily thought that Scott Morrison was surprised. But I think it's safe to say he was. I mean, you could see that from some of his reactions. The relationship is always going to have its challenges. There's domestic policies there that are going to, one side's kind of like and the other's not. But yeah, really, really interesting to see Jacinda Ardern just kind of stamp her mark a little bit there today. And interesting too, because obviously we know Jacinda Ardern plays quite a role on the international stage, and you see other leaders around the world sort of really hitch to her star quite a bit. Scott Morrison clearly not interested in doing that today. He was holding his ground well and truly.
Thanks, Joe. That is our political reporter, Joe Moyer, joining us from Sydney, where Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has had a press conference after her bilateral meeting with the Aussie PM Scott Morrison.